Hi, I'm Duncan Regehr. I played Ronin in The Next Generation and Shakaar in Deep Space Nine, and you are listening to Trek Untold.
Hello and welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. The 7th season of Star Trek The Next Generation was an interesting one, as they sort of cut loose in their final year and made a lot of very interesting stories. After all, we're talking about the same season that brought us Masaka and Corgano, David Cronenberg Barclay, cellular peptide cake with mint frosting, and of course, the infamous sex candle ghost who gives Dr. Beverly Crusher what she sure wasn't getting from Captain Picard. And today, we're talking with that ectoplasmic ladies' man who taught the good doctor that bustin' makes her feel good. Duncan Regehr played Ronin on the 7th season TNG episode Sub Rosa, and that episode has now become part of some of the biggest memes in Star Trek history. You may also remember him as Shakaar from 3 appearances on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, including the self-titled Season 3 episode Shakaar, the Season 4 episode Crossfire, and finally in the Season 5 episode The Begotten. In addition to his time on Trek, Duncan is also remembered for roles in the new Zorro television series as Zorro, Dracula in the Monster Squad film, Prince Blackpool in Wizards and Warriors, and many other appearances in TV shows and films. But what you may not know about Mr. Regehr is that he's also an accomplished painter and esteemed writer of poetry and prose, as well as a pugilist, swordsman, and a figure skater. Duncan is one of the most diversely talented guests we've had here on Trek Untold, and his passion for creativity shines in every facet of the arts that he's involved in. And I hope that with today's episode, you get a little bit of a taste of who Duncan Regehr truly is, because he's a lot more than just the sex candle ghost. But before we jump into today's interview, I want to ask you if you're following us yet on social media. If you're not, you can check out Trek Untold on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and we update there constantly. It's the best way to find out who this week's guest is going to be in advance, and also potentially ask them any questions when we offer that option. So that's Trek Untold, one word, no spaces, on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you'd like to help support the show, you can check out teespring.com/stores/trekuntold to take a look at some of the merchandise we have there, which includes t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, stickers, and all sorts of other things. We'll be releasing new designs constantly, so make sure to keep an eye there if you'd like to support this show and show off to your friends how much you like it. You can also directly support this show by visiting patreon.com/trekuntold to become a Patreon. But most important of all, please make sure to subscribe to this podcast, and if you're listening to it on iTunes, Spotify, Google, or any other audio forms, make sure to leave a review and a rating and drop some stars if you can. And if you're watching the YouTube version, please don't forget to subscribe to Nerd News Today, the channel that you're watching this on, and give the video a thumbs up. And of course, while you're at it, feel free to comment there and let me know what you think of this week's guest. Subscribing, leaving ratings, leaving comments are all some of the most important things you can do to help this podcast continue to grow and ensure that more people find out about this show. And if you're already following us or supporting us on Patreon or bought some merch, a big thank you for doing that, or offering your support in whatever way that you can. Thank you for the help. There's a lot of Star Trek podcasts out there, and I'm very grateful that you've chosen to listen to this one today. I'd also like to make a quick shout out to our sponsor at Triple Fiction Productions, who makes some amazing 3D printed Star Trek inspired dioramas and props for both Star Trek action figures and Star Trek fans in person. Whether you're a cosplayer or a toy collector, there's plenty of stuff to check out from Triple Fiction Productions, but you're going to hear a little bit more about them later on. Now, without further ado, let's beam up today's guest. Computer, access interview file. Hello, welcome back to Trek Untold, and now joining me on the opposite side of the screen, we have a man who is a master performer on the screen, as well as a master of the visual and literary arts. He's scoffing right now, but it's very much true. It's today a privilege to be speaking with Mr. Duncan Regehr. Duncan, how are you today?
Pretty good, and thank you for having me, Matthew. Good to see you.
It's really exciting to chat with you because I've seen you in so many things, and it's one of those cases where, I speak to a lot of actors in the show, and I'll recognize their faces, but I won't necessarily know their names. So I'm glad that I finally figured out who the heck you are. And yeah, this is going to be exciting today, I'm pretty sure.
Me too.
So let's kick things off here with the first question I like to ask all of my guests, and that is, what is your earliest memory of Star Trek?
Wow. Well, it would have been the William Shatner version. Yeah, that would be it back then. That would be my earliest memory of Star Trek.
Did you watch it as a kid growing up?
I think on and off, not a lot. But yeah, I think I I remember things like Triffids and yeah.
Triffids were a different movie. That's a different franchise
Oh,
altogether.
it's a different franchise. Well, what were those little things, those fluffy things that
Those fluffy
were?
things are Tribbles. Triffids are from, I think, a 1960s horror movie, actually.
Well, maybe you're right. Of course, you're right. Yeah, it shows you how much I know about science fiction. Absolutely nothing.
So, can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, who your parents were, and what little Duncan wanted to be when he grew up and became an adult?
Well, my parents were very different from each other, actually. My father came from Russia as an immigrant, a Mennonite, with a group of other Mennonites. And I mean, they had no money. They were very poor people, but, they were willing to work. So they sort of brought themselves along. And eventually, I mean, he joined the Canadian Army and worked in intelligence there because he could speak several languages. Um, and, went forward with his career and life to become a bacteriologist. And, my mother was English, and she came over during the Second World War and worked as a physiotherapist in the Canadian Army and met my father, and they got married and had a bunch of kids, me being one of them. And we lived in a fairly rural area. And my dad was also a kind of an amateur painter. He never had really the opportunity to become a professional in any respect because he was too busy earning a living for his family in other ways. But he was always very encouraging to, say, if you want to paint something, here's a bunch of brushes and some paint, and go over there and stay out of my way and make something. So that was one way of learning about art. And my mother was very, very intelligent woman. She had a vast knowledge of literature and medicine, and I think she's probably responsible for instilling my interest in poetry and theater and literature, because I was fascinated by it from a very early age, and I knew very early on that I was going to grow up to be an artist, a painter. And I think by the age of 12, I was pretty much resolved to be an actor as well, and started, became a professional when I was 16 and started working in theater. So that's sort of the beginning of things.
But I believe you were also doing some more physical things too, right? Like I know at some point you got into fencing. I'd read, maybe this is incorrect, but I read that you were involved in figure skating briefly.
That's true.
That's
I
true
was.
also. Okay. And I'd also heard that you were an Olympic boxing contender. So you were doing a lot of things.
Yeah, no, I think the boxing came a bit later, obviously. Figure skating I was never drawn to. I was pretty good at it, but it wasn't something that I really stuck inside. It wasn't in my heart to do it. And I think, later going into boxing, somehow boxing seemed to be the antithesis of figure skating to me for whatever reason. And, or maybe I had these sort of Hemingway type issues with myself, having to prove myself in some way. So I got involved with that and did okay with it.
So did you go to school to pursue acting or different type of arts? What was your outlook at that point?
Uh, I did dabble a little bit with the Bastion Theatre School in Victoria, British Columbia, but not really very much, just maybe a few months, because I was working as a professional already at the age of 16 and, involved with Shakespeare. And it just went from there. I just sort of, even before I finished high school, I was already working. So,
So how does a 16-year-old find Shakespeare and learn to understand and appreciate it?
well, as I say, my mother was influential in that area. She always made sure the literature was lying around, and I found it fascinating. Started writing my own works back then. And yeah, I just loved the language.
So for a lot of performers we've spoken to on the show, they really enjoy the rush of being on stage. Some just perform the art of acting. Others prefer to just talk about the literary beauty in the words. For you, what was it that actually drew you to pursue acting, especially at this young age? What energy was forcing you towards that direction?
I loved creating roles. I liked interpreting material and understanding the themes within a script and making it come to life. I think I was less attracted to the thrill of the crowd and all of that, although it is something that is quite magical when you connect with an audience and sort of become one being in a strange way. it is a collaborative. And I always used to say to fellow performers when, they'd say, well, the crowd out there is dead, they're just, it's not working tonight. We just can't get this thing off the ground. And I said, well, they're 50% of the equation. The audience is involved in this. So if it's an off night, maybe it's cold and rainy outside or whatever, or you know, whatever the energies are that are going on have some influence over how people will react to what you're doing on stage. So don't take the whole shoulder of the blame if it's not working that well. It's just what it is sometimes.
As far as performing goes, were there any lessons that you picked up during these early formative years on stage that you've continued to use with you throughout your years?
I think it is that connection with the audience. I mean, even with, people say connect to the camera for film, and the camera will find you. Obviously, that's how you kind of deal with it. But I think it's really important to remember that there is an audience out there at some level of yourself. We do an awful lot of stuff today where you just kind of, it's a form of behavior rather than acting, to me, at least for film and TV. And of course, that's dependent upon the script. If it's a lousy script, then, what are you going to do? But if it's a good script, you can really get into it intensely and find the role and be the role and make the magic.
So, Duncan, do you remember what your very first professional TV gig was? And do you remember what it was like to go from that change from a stage to a set?
My first experience was actually a film with the National Film Board of Canada in Montreal, and it was called The War Is Over. And I played a shell-shocked sergeant coming home on a ship from the trenches, basically. And it's how his story unfolds. It was the early understanding of, this kind of post-traumatic syndrome in soldiers. And, I had some experience of that with my grandfather, who fought in both First World War and Second World War, and indeed in the trenches. And he wasn't too forthcoming with his experiences, but I could see, certainly by the time I was a teenager, that he experienced, extraordinary things in those two world wars, nightmares, the whole, and as an elderly gentleman, he would never talk about it, but he experienced some extraordinary things, I'm sure. He would have the nightmares, screaming and, reliving everything. But we treat it all differently today. We have a way of dealing with soldiers that have dealt with that kind of thing. And back then it was just suck it up and get on with it,
So during this time,
I digress. Sorry.
No,
that was my first film experience.
So during this time period also, were there any actors that you emulated or that you admired that you wanted to try and be like, and that maybe got you more interested in acting?
I liked several films. I think, Man for All Seasons was interesting to me. Beckett with, what's his name? It's gone for my Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton. And those were interesting films that were influential. But I was in the theater, so I was more drawn to that type of classical work at that time.
And being then later in the industry in Hollywood as well, not too long after that point, did you ever get to meet any of your heroes?
I guess I did. I also from the world of horror, I was really intrigued. One of my first jobs in Hollywood was to work with Christopher Lee, who was the famous Dracula, and that was wonderful. I really enjoyed that.
So one of the biggest roles that you had early on that I want to talk about is My Wicked Wicked Ways, where you played Errol Flynn, which was very transformative role. I got to watch it. It's actually on YouTube, the whole thing. I got to watch it. It was amazing watching you transform from Duncan Regehr into Errol Flynn. Just see not just the physicality, but your entire persona. So I'm curious, how you achieved that transformation from Duncan into one of the most famous leading men in all of Hollywood.
Good question. I was doing, I think, The Last Days of Pompeii at the time when they offered that part to me, and I had very little time to prepare for it. 2 weeks. I came back from London, and started work on research right away. And it was really one film of Flynn's that was of paramount interest to me, and that was Gentleman Jim. That's where the characters suddenly clicked for me, and I suddenly got an essence of Flynnishness out of that. Yeah, I think that was the key.
And that film also featured a lot of folks who would go on to appear in Star Trek, like Denise Crosby, Dick Durock, Alan Oppenheimer, who we also know as the voice of Skeletor. Do you remember ever working with any of those folks, or any other folks who went on to be in Star Trek? I know you're not a big Trek fan necessarily, but did you recall any of those people?
Well, from then, but not now, right? Yeah, I haven't seen them for years.
Do you remember working on set with them at all?
Not particularly. I mean, we are talking about something that's about 30 years ago.
It's only
So
30 years.
yeah, what the heck? Come on, Duncan. Where's your memory? Sure. I mean, I remember faces and try to put names together and that sort of thing. If they remembered something, I might say, "Oh yeah, I do remember that." That kind of thing.
So Errol Flynn, again, he's also known for being the sword fighter in so many of his films. And for you, again, coming from this fencing background, I'd like to learn a little bit more actually about that. So when you were learning fencing, was this more so for an actual athletic pursuit, or was it for stage and screen?
It was for stage. I was actually trained by a gentleman named Patrick Crane, who was the famous stage choreographer for sword fighting, and I worked with him at Stratford, and he taught me sort of the beginnings of fencing, stage fencing in particular, which isn't real fencing. It's got to be dramatic, theatrical, all the rest of it. Big sweeping moves and then little moves and what have you. And he was sort of the instigator for that, and so I knew how to fence before I got to do the film, and then later, of course, came Zorro, when I think I spent 90% of my time with a sword in my hand, and then I would say that my fencing or sword fighting in general improved a great deal for me with Peter Diamond, who did Princess Bride, among other things, and he was probably the greatest film swordsman ever. And I learned a great deal from him. I was, to the point where I was able to develop my own technique for sword fighting, combination of saber and foil, so that you'd get the big sweeping moves in a fight. You could do, all the jumping around off balconies and, chandeliers and all that stuff. But you could also do intimate work very, very, very fast. You don't have to worry about that today because it's all enhanced, computer enhanced stuff and sped up, and it's all very different. Back in those days, we had to do it ourselves.
And thank you for making that perfect segue into Zorro, because of course I have to ask about that. You were Zorro from 1990 to 1993, and we mentioned Peter Diamond. He was a stunt coordinator on the show.
Yes.
And I actually had watched an interview with Henry Darrow, who co-starred with you in Zorro.
Yeah.
And he was saying how when he did all his fight scenes, the swords were not tipped, which means they had the sharp points sticking out. And it was meant to be very physical, very aggressive kind of style. Working on a show like Zorro, which is such a very physical show, and you're spending so much time with that sword in your hand and fending off. This is my fencing hand, by the way, folks. This is me fencing. You're spending so much time doing this very physical role. What's it like just to go from something more classical to something so action packed and physically challenging?
I mean, it was really, with that particular role, I was really playing two roles: the Don Diego role, the side of things, and then the masked, sort of hero type. And so there were contrasts in there as well. But it was a combination of everything that I sort of knew how to do, which is probably one of the reasons why I got the part, was because I could ride horses. I owned horses and I raised horses, and so I could do all of that type of work that was required, and I knew how to fence, so that was okay. I had all those things at my disposal, and the physicality of the part was a wonderful investigation for me. As sort of traditionally we think of Zorro as the fox, which is what Zorro means in English, is the fox, but I sort of treated the character more like a panther. His moves were cat-like rather than, they weren't fox-like, they were cat-like. And that worked for me, that imagery. And, and also encompassed it into the sword fighting. There was always kind of a sense of I wanted a sense of humor with it. So there was a whimsicalness to his approach to things, and absolute confidence in any fight that he was in, that he would ever be in any kind of danger. He was never concerned about that character.
Yeah, I like the idea of him being more of a panther as opposed to a fox, and that kind of leads me to my next question, because the part of Zorro has been played by many, many famous leading men throughout Hollywood. We're talking
Right.
about Tyrone Powell, Douglas Fairbanks, more contemporary to around that time period. You would have had Antonio Banderas, I think actually a few years
Yes.
after yours. Alain Delon played Zorro briefly in a movie in, I think it was in Spain, actually. So what did you do? You kind of talked about it right here, but what did you do to make Zorro and also the alter ego of the character become yourself, become your own version and your own interpretation of the character?
Yeah, it was that was an interesting process too, because I started out wanting to make a bigger contrast between the Zorro character and the Don Diego character. I really wanted them to have a big division between the two, because it seemed to make more sense to me. The producers didn't want that, though. I tried very hard to say, well, why don't we do the Don Diego character kind of like a Ben Franklin type with the pince-nez glasses and the stoop and the long hair. He could have blonde hair instead of black hair, and then he just sticks on a mustache and the mask, and he goes out and does the hero work that way. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. There has to be kind of an essence of Don Diego in the Zorro character and vice versa. So that balance I had to kind of achieve and set aside my own artistic interpretation of the character. Otherwise, I'd get fired.
As we mentioned, you worked with Henry Darrow. He was, in fact, the first Latin American person to ever play Zorro in
Yeah.
television, and
Yeah.
a veteran actor. What did you learn from working with him?
Lightning in a bottle. He's great fun. Just wonderful, wonderful humor and chutzpah in that guy. He's just great. He could turn it on, and even when he was really, really tired, Henry would always come with the goods. Lots good chops. That's Henry. Great chops, as we say in the theater.
So one other thing I wanted to talk about before we do jump into Star Trek, and I think that's where I probably first ever saw you, and that's in Monster Squad. And I know you still get recognized all over the place for being a Monster Squad. We just talked about it with Christopher Lee as well, and some of the horror stuff there. But yeah, I heard on Monster Squad, you actually stayed in character as Dracula during the entire filming, even off set. Is that true?
Well, I think more of what it was that I separated myself from the kids.
Okay.
And we I sat down and talked about it with the producers and from the director Fred Decker and Peter Hyams, and it was sort of an interesting approach to take, because the little kids were totally into it. They believed in everything they were doing. They were running around all over the place, and they were these fearsome monster people around all over the place. And it just seemed to work better for them if you stayed kind of close to that character and avoided allowing them to see you as a normal person.
One of the things that always sticks out to me about that film and about your character in particular is that Dracula's throwing sticks of dynamite. And that's just so crazy to me. So I just got to ask, like, when you got to that page of the script during your first reading, what did you think of that revelation?
Well, there were lots of things in that I was trying to achieve with that particular character. I wanted to make him actually less of a sort of conventional monster. I think the human aspects of us, the darker human aspects of us, are far more frightening than, say, some kind of growling monster that you can deal with. But he was psychological. He was a sociopath. He had a goal in mind, and nothing was going to get in his way. And he was absolutely vicious. But he had a sense of humor. He had to be, back then we'd call it camp. He was pretty camp as a character, and so throwing dynamite and saying meeting adjourned and stuff like that was a wonderful way to approach the thing, I felt.
But it's kind of perfect for a character like that. And I love when you in particular play those types of roles. Like I think it was Wizards and Warlocks is the show also. I'm trying to remember that's name.
Wizards and Warriors, yeah.
Wizards and Warriors, yeah.
Same sort of thing. The bad guy, with all the leather and everything, and just always had a kind of a tongue in cheek about everything.
I mean, are you attracted to those kinds of roles? Do you like those roles where the character is very inflated and larger than life in that kind of way?
I do, actually. I like the iconic sort of roles. I played quite a few of them, but it's not always of that ilk. At one point I was thinking, is there a character I'm going to play here in Hollywood that isn't wearing black? Because the list was just growing. but there are other iconic characters that I played. Hey, Abraham Lincoln, for example, for on stage was fantastic opportunity, and so that I am attracted to those larger than life roles. It seems even Ronin. If you look at Ronin in the Next Generation as the what do they call him, the sex candle ghost or something. Um, yeah, that kind of character. It's still kind of iconic, very, very, very much that way.
Trek Untold will return momentarily. Trek Untold is brought to you by Triple Fiction Productions. If you're a Star Trek cosplayer looking for props, or a toy collector looking to spice up your shelves, Triple Fiction Productions has you covered. Triple Fiction Productions produces affordable and unique 3D printed Trek-inspired products from the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Enterprise, and the movies. You can expect the same amount of care and attention to detail in any of the items in their catalog, whether it's a prop replica for use in a fan film, or a part of a cosplay, or accessories and playsets for figures from Playmates, Migos, or Diamond Select. Own your very own tricorder or phaser rifle with working lights, the bridge of the Enterprise E for your Playmates figures, or any other item from countless species and ships from the Star Trek universe. All products are 3D printed in the USA and are constantly evolving and improving based on fan feedback. To learn more about their products, visit them at triple-fictionproductions.net or on Facebook at facebook.com/triplefictionproductions. Triple Fiction Productions, taking Star Trek where no 3D printer has gone before.
Hello, everyone. I'm Armin Shimmerman. Perhaps you know me better as Quark from Deep Space Nine. As your favorite Ferengi, I'm here to promote a sale. It's not self-sealing stem bolts, but my new novel, Illyria. And the first book is called The Portrayal of Angels. Some of you may not know that aside from being an actor, I'm also a novelist. My newest novel is a mystery set in 1583. Its heroes are the historical characters of John Dee, who was a spiritualist, a book collector, and a spy. With him is an unsuccessful playwright named William Shakespeare. Their mission is to investigate a nobleman who happens to be Count Orsino from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The book employs comedy, history, and fantasy to tell a page-turner of a story. The adventure is a trilogy, and the first book goes on sale November 5th, which happens to be my birthday. It reads a lot like Sherlock Holmes, or like one of my favorite shows, Homeland. Please check out my website at www.arminshimmerman, get the name right, .com, or you can get it directly from my publisher at www.jumpmasterpress.com. You can buy it either as a paperback, a hardback, or an ebook. So why don't you check it out and judge for yourself? Or better yet, give it as a gift to someone. I know they'll appreciate it. Disclaimer, no latinum accepted.
We now return to Trek Untold.
All right, well, Duncan, since you brought up the sex candle ghost, we got to start talking about Star Trek. I think it's only appropriate now. So as we mentioned, you first appeared in Season 7 of Star Trek The Next Generation, the episode Sub Rosa. You were Ronin, also known as Casper the Gropey Ghost, and the sex candle ghost.
Okay.
That's the name I'm giving you now, is Casper the Gropey Ghost. I'm going with that one.
Okay.
So can you tell us a little bit about the audition process for this role, and did you know you're going to be giving Beverly Crusher some phantom orgasms here?
Yeah, when I read the script. She was so lovely, a wonderful, wonderful actress, such a smart woman, and makes wonderful choices. She was just great. No, I had no idea that I would be groping Beverly Crusher, as you say.
Yeah, the interesting thing I find about the show also is that we're talking about Star Trek. This is a show that takes place in the future, but this episode in particular, it's much more like a period piece.
Right, exactly.
And I find that pretty interesting. And the way this episode is approached, it's very much like a classic 1930s Universal horror picture in a lot of ways, too.
Yeah.
So, was that, again, another thing that would have attracted you to this role? Was that something that was even discussed when you were doing the auditions for it? Or was it just something that, it was a thing and you did what you had to do?
Well, he was supposed to be, descended from Scottish royalty in some way, which at that time, the fictitious time that it was set in, he would have been an Englishman. So there was no Scottish accent applied on top of that. He would be an Englishman. So, and that's basically how I played him. But there were other things that, the script sort of arrived in bits and pieces too. It wasn't complete, immediately, as I recall.
Do you remember much about the audition for this role?
Not really. Not really. I remember waiting to go in to talk to them the first time, and who should show up but Michael Tylo, who had just, I just worked with in Zorro. He used to play the alcalde, and he showed up as well. So it's kind of nice. That's all I remember about it. I mean, I just went in and did my thing, whatever it was, and the next thing I know, they say, well, they want you to do the role. I kind of thought they did before I went in, actually, to be honest.
As we mentioned, and as anyone who's seen the episode knows, you spend most of your time on screen with Gates McFadden as Beverly Crusher.
Right.
So, you already said some nice things about her, but what else do you remember about acting with her? And especially in this case, in this episode, her character is acting very much out of character.
Right. Well, most of the stuff was fairly romantic. And, it's the stuff of, bodice rippers and that kind of thing. So it was lovely. And she kind of understood that. It's an interesting thing when you meet people who are very familiar with the theater as she is. And there's sort of an instant acceptance and camaraderie that exists, like a bonding. We're of the same creed or whatever. And so that was there for sure from the very, very get-go. Likewise with Patrick,
Was there any inspiration from other famous characters in movies or anything else that you pulled from to play the sex scandal ghost? I'm just going to keep calling him sex scandal ghost. I can't call him Ronin. I'm sorry.
I didn't know it was called that for the longest time, and then somebody else pointed it out to me. And but I think it's a great title.
Fairly accurate too.
Fairly accurate, and I think I love the notion that the episode is both kind of affectionately lauded and critically derided in a way as well. It gives it an air of notoriety, but I didn't base it on anything in particular. Just sort of went with what the script is and had an understanding of it, sort of a Byron-esque type of character, which is more about poetry than an actual character. That was where I came from with it, I think.
When you put it in that perspective, it does kind of make sense because he is a classical bad guy character, but
Right.
he's also very lyrical, and there is something kind of magnetic and charismatic about the character.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when you guys are filming the scenes where your ghost essence is doing your thing to Beverly Crusher, do you remember any off-camera reaction to Gates having her various reactions, let's just say?
I do remember one instance where she was kind of writhing around on the bed, having all these feelings, and suddenly she got into this very peculiar position where her rear end was right into the camera lens. I think it was Jonathan Frakes who said, something to the effect of, no, you don't want Gates. No, maybe not that way. Maybe not that way. Roll the other way.
We just mentioned Jonathan Frakes. Of course, he was the director for this episode. What do you recall about his directing style?
Well, he's got a wonderful sense of humor. He's a great guy. We were neighbors at the time, and he's a wonderful, and he has an incredibly optimistic approach to what he's doing. He's actually an actor's dream as a director. He's really wonderful and has a great understanding because he is himself an actor. So I think actors love Jonathan Frakes.
And since we did mention that you are kind of already aware of the fan reaction, I mean, are you surprised that it's had this much of a reaction this many years later? It's still talked about. I'm in all sorts of Star Trek groups on Facebook.
Really?
And at least once a week, if not more, I'm seeing somebody bring up Sub Rosa. It just comes up. And they even joked about it in the Star Trek Lower Deck show recently.
Wonderful. I had no idea. That's great. Yeah.
Do you get that reaction from a lot of fans? Do you go to conventions that when they realize you're the sex scandal ghost?
Yeah, there are people who come to conventions that are specifically there for that reason. I'm sure they have a list of other things, but when they approach me, their reason is because of Ronin, or because of, yes, Ronin, that's his name, or the sex scandal ghost, whatever.
So that was Duncan's appearance in TNG in the episode Beverly Crusher and the Phantom Orgasm. But after that, he returned for Deep Space Nine, and this time with a much meatier role as Shakaar.
Right.
So you came in the episode actually called Shakaar, who you returned again in season 4 for Crossfire, and then season 5 in The Begotten. So let's start off first with the character of Shakaar here. Did you know from the onset that this would have the potential to be returning again and again as a recurring character?
It's always talked about, as they are these types of characters. They're always saying, well, there could be a recurring role, so why don't you come on in and do this? And then, it either turns out or it doesn't, and in this case it did. They, what they were saying did evolve. And so, yeah, I guess I sort of suspected that it would happen. Yeah.
Do you recall if you had to audition for this part, or did they say, hey, let's bring back that sex scandal ghost guy for this episode?
I don't think I auditioned for it. I'm pretty sure I didn't. Yeah, I think they just offered it.
So I've read that this role was meant to be very much like Emiliano Zapata. I've heard Robert Wolf talk about that. So when you were approaching this character, when you were starting to do research for it and figure out your voice for Shakaar, what did you do to try and create that character?
Again, he was very much a swashbuckling hero type, which I, absolutely familiar with. And particularly at that time, I was playing so many of those types of roles. So I had a lot of things to draw upon to create that role. He wasn't Zorro because he was, maybe a bit, he didn't have the refined sort of approach to the fighting skills and all of that, which was with the bailiwick of Nana's character. They were, the more martial arts type. He was more like John Wayne going in and slugging it out with people. So he was a rougher kind of rebel hero. So I just put some edges on him, and so it was a lot of fun to play that character. I had less interest in it later on when they turned him into the prime minister, because I actually would have been content if I'd just done the one episode in many respects. I understood that character. When he transformed into the prime minister, he sort of lost an agenda there. I didn't really know where he was going to go or what he was going to be. And it didn't really speak to me anymore.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was actually something I was wondering about. Having just rewatched the episodes, I felt that, between the two characters you played in the Star Trek franchise, I felt in some ways, hot take here, that Ronin was actually a much meatier character, despite Shakaar having 3 episodes. Since Ronin really has a full episode that is about himself, whereas Shakaar gets the episode called Shakaar, but then the 2 follow-ups that we see you in Crossfire, you're basically the B plot, and you're more there as a vehicle for the character Odo, trying to search for his humanity. And similarly, in The Begotten, again, that episode is an all Odo episode. You're brought in as comic relief. So, do you have any thoughts about that too? I mean, which role do you feel is actually a more substantial role for you?
To me, it was kind of baffling, because I thought, well, these are different characters. The character I was interested in was the character in Shakaar. That's what I was. That would have worked for me. I understood that character. He had an agenda. He was focused, and he was full of vitality and strong, selfless man of action kind of thing. And then, but the other character I didn't get as the prime minister. His destiny became very vague to me. And as you say, they popped him around all over the place, which eventually just didn't work for me. It wasn't a good fit for me, I felt anyway.
I think as a fan, I can say that I honestly did think that the Ronin performance was definitely a stronger role in just that one episode, as opposed to how it was in these 3 episodes, because it really did feel like Shakaar got neutered essentially as we went along.
Yeah,
he kind of lost a lot of power.
That's a good way of putting it. That's a good way of putting it. And it's just not something that would work for me. And in terms of, as you say, a B plot, I think it was actually felt more like a C or a D plot, after a while. And it's not the sort of thing that as an artist I will spend my time on, to be perfectly honest. There's other things that I want to do and to carry on. But that said, it was wonderful to work with the people. I loved Nana Visitor. She's a beautiful woman and easy to fall in love with. And, they were just wonderful people. And Rene Aubergenois was such a wonderful raconteur. I'd love to sit with Rene and hear his stories and his viewpoints on things. He was such a wonderful, intelligent actor.
I've heard great things about both of them. I'm never going to, unfortunately, be able to ever meet Rene, sadly. But, in this episode, you do get to spend a lot of time, of course, with the Visitor.
I worked with Rene previously on Billy the Kid, Gore Vidal's Billy the Kid. Yeah, he played the drunk in it wonderfully. Beautiful drunk.
Do you have any stories you can share with us about Renee?
Just that there was nothing active that actually happened. I was just, I was fascinated with his viewpoints on things. I love people who have ideas. I love to listen to ideas all the time. And he certainly had them. And, political or otherwise, he would come up with, lots of different viewpoints. And I enjoyed that aspect of him. Likewise with Nana, she took an interest in my art, and we did a little bit of socializing, not too much, but I think she came to one of my exhibits in Santa Monica. Yeah.
So what's it like sharing the screen with Nana? I've heard from pretty much everybody she's an excellent scene partner, but how would you describe working with her?
Well, she's got these eyes that are just, you fall into. They're like these brown pools, beautiful, So, but she's also got a wonderful sense of humor. You just feel very, very comfortable with her. And she goes out of her way to make, people comfortable. I saw her doing it with others. And, she's really a very special actor.
I feel like anytime I've seen her in anything, especially, of course, Deep Space Nine, she just has this instant connection with anybody that she's working with, and it feels real in the scene.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more.
So the episode Shakaar that we've been talking about as well, that was mostly filmed in Bronson Canyon. And I heard that, in particular, the days you guys were shooting there, it was extremely cold. Do you recall anything about the first episode you appeared in and all the outdoor scenes you guys filmed?
Yes. I remember trying to get warm by drinking coffee, what I thought was coffee. And I love coffee. I've just come back from Spain and, drinking all this wonderful stuff, probably too much. But they had the coffee urns out there in the first thing in the morning. And I thought, well, I'll go and fill up on this stuff. And, there's two different urns, one for decaf and one for caffeinated coffee. So I'm pouring in, drinking this stuff all morning. And before we actually got to my first scene with Nana, I had the worst headache I've ever had in my life. I couldn't understand why I had this headache. I found out later that they'd made a mistake with the coffee. They put the decaf in the caffeinated urn, and the little orange tab on the thing. Yeah, I wasn't getting the real goods that I was used to every morning, so I ended up with a coffee sort of headache. That's what I remember about it, trying to get through these scenes with Nana, who was quite wonderful, but I could barely move. I was so blasted with a headache.
And especially for the episode where you're running around up and down canyons and hills and all sorts of things. That sounds like a rough day.
Absolutely dying.
So since you're one of the actors who has been on TNG and Deep Space Nine, how would you describe differences between the sets? And I don't mean the actual physical locations, but the feeling on set.
Oh, I guess they're not that much different from each other, I don't think. I mean, I didn't have enough experience on Next Generation to know. It was all interior. And the Deep Space Nine, there was some exterior that I was involved in. There's that difference. But yeah, I didn't really notice too much difference. I wasn't concerned about those sort of things anyway, really.
So in your last DS9 appearance, most of that episode was spent with Nana Visitor, but you also have spent some time with Colm Meaney and Rosalind Chow. Can you recall anything with them? Because that was basically, as we mentioned before, kind of a scene that was meant for laughs. It was you at the day that Kira is giving birth, and you're all trying to keep yourselves quiet, but meanwhile, you and O'Brien, Colm Meaney, are just arguing back and forth the whole time. Do you recall much about working with Colm? And Rosalind, I should say. Colm and Rosalind.
Well, they're both wonderful actors. What can I say? And she's just was such a gentle kind of giving person, and Colm is absolutely dynamic. He's all over the place. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I think he's very, very sharp. When I say being all over the place, he doesn't miss a thing. It made for a kind of a difference of the two individuals. She was very, very gentle and almost Zen-like to me in her approach to things. She was just lovely. Yeah.
As we mentioned, The Begotten is the final appearance of Shakaar, and the breakup between Kira and Shakaar happens off camera. It's talked about basically in passing in an episode. But was there ever any mention of bringing you back to do the breakup on screen?
I don't think so. I think I'd moved on. I was involved in something else, another film. I mean, I've heard about this, but I didn't know anything about it at the time. I just had sort of moved on.
Now, when any of these episodes that you did in Star Trek first aired, or since then, I should say too, have you ever watched them back?
Have I ever watched them again?
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen the Shakaar. I don't think I've seen the Deep Space Nine stuff. Maybe. Oh, I mean, Shakaar. Yes, I've seen the Shakaar episode and I've seen Ronin, but I think that's about it. Yeah, the rest, I'm trying to remember the rest.
Are you the kind of actor that likes to watch your past performances, or do you prefer to stay away from it and move on?
I just kind of move on. Is really me. I mean, I'll go and look at rushes and things like that if I'm asked. And I mean, I don't know what people do now about that sort of thing, but if somebody wants me to see something or to work on something, and I'll go and look at it, of course. You know, but I don't spend a lot of time looking at myself on the screen. I haven't even seen half of the Zorros that I did. Not even half. Maybe not even a quarter of them. Very few.
Were you ever called back to audition for any other roles in Star Trek, or did you have the desire to ever come back in the other franchises?
I don't think so. I mean, prior to those two roles, I think I'd been asked but wasn't available. Um, yeah, I think it's a long time ago.
So one other thing I want to discuss here today from your acting career is this is another oddity for you, Air Bud 3. I have to ask you about that today. I can't let you walk out of here without discussing Air Bud 3. What do you recall from that film? Because I don't even know where to begin with Air Bud 3.
Um, it's about a dog, right?
That's not with the dog who
I
the
remember
Labrador.
the puppies. I
Yep.
remember a lot of puppies, which were delightful. And a character that was completely bizarre and, sort of a nerdy father type I was playing. And he gets locked in a closet. He's totally hopeless. And it was fun to do, a bit of a contrast. But yeah, it was just a lark, fun to do. Shot it in Vancouver.
Must be nice. The easy commute.
Easy commute for me. Yeah.
So let's jump ahead now, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time discussing your literary and your art career because typically we talk about a lot of acting, that kind of stuff on this show, but you are truly a Renaissance man of the arts, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your art, what you do. You've got several books that you've published now. I know you've got one I think coming out as well. So let's just start first things first. Talk to us a little bit about, if you can, to our viewers, describe what you would call your art. I know it's a very big, broad question, but I've been watching a lot of YouTube videos and trying to get my head around it as well, and looking at the various evolutions of your artwork from the '90s to I guess now, whatever I can find. There's definitely, I feel like, a lot of changes, a lot of evolution, a lot of growth. But these days, how would you describe it to someone who's looking at it for the very first time?
Um, well, it's. I would say I've moved through a great many different series of works. Even changing styles, which drives my dealers crazy, but because they like to latch on to something that they can market and have a common theme to it and everything, and that kind of locks me into it. It's like saying, you've got to play this role for the rest of your life. And I'm more interested in finding some versatility with that and exploring different themes and philosophies, and that's how what comes through, I think, in my work. It's always a study of the human condition. Most of my work is figurative, whether it's sculpture or painting or drawing or whatever. But moving through various series, I mean, in the last 5 decades, we actually sat down at the gallery and tried to figure out how many different series of paintings, not how many paintings, I can't count that, that's thousands, but certainly different series of works. In the last 5 decades, 48 different series. So they're very, very different from each other, almost as though they were done by different artists at times, I think. I've been told that anyway.
That's always a good thing for the artist because that shows your personal growth, your evolving thought in the process. And just again, from being the outsider looking at the work you've done, I can see that the process has very much changed for you. As we mentioned, you've done a lot of figures. There's also been landscapes or geoscapes, as you've called them as well, and they're all very much meant to be evocative of the subconscious. So, what is it that attracts you?
Quite often, yeah.
What would you say attracts you to that particular thought of the subconscious and trying to express it on a canvas?
Well, I think it's not the only place that I go to, but it is. It is very much about human beings. So the subconscious is quite often where the I hesitate to say the truth comes out, but certainly what is sometimes hidden and can be exposed about us can come out. But I painted other things that are much more related to our social environment and politics, even at times, religion, and it's just moving through various phases of these things and working with them. Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, and it manifests in poetry as well. I don't really write poetry or write prose that is directly related to a specific piece, but you can find relationships between the written work and the visual work, but they're not for each other in any way. In other words, the poetry isn't a description of a painting, and the painting is not, a visual of what's written there.
I watched a few interviews that you've done discussing your artwork on YouTube that I've found, and you've talked a lot about the process of how you gesso your canvas, how you basically prepare your canvas to be painted on. It's a very meticulous process, and I find that a lot of your work that I've looked at, it is very, very much meticulous is a good word I like to use for it because there's a lot going on. They're very complex pieces, but on the same token, you're also working with the subconscious, and that's a very that's a very immediate kind of thought. So I find that to be an interesting contrast to go from basically something that's meant to be so immediate to an artistic process that is very, I don't want to say long or drawn out because that's not what I mean to say, but something that's got a lot of prep work into it and a lot of thought behind it. It's just an observation I had. I don't know if you have any comments about that.
Well, it is one way of working that I've employed over the years. I mean, I don't have a set way of preparing anymore, but there was certainly a time when I employed a lot more of what we call automatism, which is, grew out of the surrealist movement. Um, and it's very, very valuable. You can use it in writing or you can use it in painting. That the idea being that the imagery that comes forth is what you intended anyway, even though it sort of happens in spite of yourself. It comes out. Yeah. So it's almost like the application and the taking away of paint is unveiling what imagery is in your subconscious. But it's only one way of working. It's not the only way that I work.
Yeah, because you've got so many things. It's hard to even really pinpoint one little thing about the artwork
That is
nowadays,
one
especially.
way that I worked. And I think I described it in the book, The Dragon's Eye, which was written about 30 years ago. Well, not quite 30 years ago. And that's probably what you're referring to is that process. Yeah.
And so for anybody who would like to learn more about Duncan's artwork, his literary pursuits, where can our listeners and our audience today check that out?
They could go to a couple of different places. DuncanRegehrArtworks.com. Or they could go to my gallery, Petley Jones Gallery in Vancouver. And the other place would be just DuncanRegehr.com. Will get you to a space where you can look at books and poetry and paintings and artwork.
So if you don't mind now, I'd like to do a little bit of, I don't want to call it a psychoanalysis, but just an observation I had about your skill set and how it's translated through various arts and what I think might be a mindset related to it and to an approach. Because as I've watched a lot of your performances in the various roles you've had, and I've watched several of your interviews you've done throughout the years, I've felt like what I've gleaned is that you're a man who doesn't like to be complacent. And we talked about that with your art style changing and all that kind of thing. You're a person that really very much likes to be challenged and not just challenging yourself, but be challenged by others. And you like to then also put that challenge onto the viewer. And in fact, there's one piece in particular I like to think of, which I don't remember the name of, you have to help me out with it. It was a piece from a few years ago where you had the heads that were on podiums and there was a little gong and you were supposed to go around and hit those. And I felt like it's literally you're challenging the viewer to do that, to take action and do this thing. And you're basically seeing, are they going to do it? Is there that sort of artistic machismo to go ahead and do that? But, basically, is that something that you feel about yourself, about your work, is that you like to be challenged and you like to also challenge other people and make them rise up to where your level is?
I think it's probably part of my nature. It's not something that if I'm challenging people, I guess it becomes challenging because look, with art, it's always about what the viewer gets from the work. It doesn't matter what my intent behind the work is. It's how it's viewed. And when people, talk about it afterwards, they always ask me questions like, what were you thinking when you painted this? And I turn it back on them and say, well, what do you think I was thinking? Because it's your reaction that will tell the truth. And quite often I find that tells me more about the viewer than anything else, simply by the question they ask about the piece, the particular piece that they're looking at, and if they're challenged by it. And we're talking specifically about the theme of the piece. I mean, I get a lot of questions like, oh, where'd you get the frame? That kind of thing, which is kind of not, in a store. But if they ask questions, questions that puzzle them, or, that it's, I find that interesting. Or if they have an idea about what that painting means to them, what it evokes in them, that's what's interesting.
We've had a lot of actors on the show who talk about the art of acting being the way to get to the truth. And the truth doesn't necessarily always mean the actor's truth. It also means, as you said, what the audience perceives that truth to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would hope that it goes beyond any intent that I would have in it, that they would have something else out of it. I love all the interpretations are great with me, good or bad, doesn't matter.
So, as a veteran of the stage and screen for so many years, so many roles, what is the one thing you wish you knew on day one that you know today that you would have loved to have told yourself back when you first began?
Oh, wow. I think, trying to make that separation at the end of the day, that it is just make believe. And, in terms of acting, and, too often we get involved with the other people that are in it as well. And in my case, romantically getting involved with ladies and what have you, and, disastrous relationships, etc. Because that would be the only message. And I see it again and again, where people get involved in a film or they're in a television series or whatever, and they marry the person that they're with in the show. And then, of course, after the show is over, life is very different. And you're not those people at all. So that's my recommendation to others, is to, really keep an eye on that. But love is love, right? You fall in love and, your brain goes dead.
So, what can you tell our audience about what Duncan Regehr is doing these days? We talked about your art and your gallery, but what else are you working on right now?
Well, I'm writing a new book, as well as, working on the material that I'm doing for the show as well. It's just a show of the pieces that I'm doing. It's not the completion of the series by any means. And I'm working on a thing called The Lost Man and The Forgotten Woman right now, these images. So I'm continuing on with that. There's more to do with that. It goes beyond this particular exhibition that I've got.
And last question for the day, Duncan. What is the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
Well, I think that it goes on. I mean, it deals with infinity, and like infinity, Star Trek keeps going on, and it changes, as all things do within the universe. And it evolves and transforms, and there's always something new to reach for. And I think we are creators, we are searchers, we are explorers as human beings. That's the common thread throughout all of us. I think a lot of us are just going to stay kind of brain dead, but most people, I think, would prefer to be creators and explore new frontiers. And that's what is wonderful about Star Trek. I say I don't have a familiarity with it in terms of watching episode after episode after episode, but the basic tenet of these various series is always about that. It's about reaching for the unknown, uncovering truth. And that's what's special about Star Trek, to me anyway.
So, Duncan, thank you so much today for sharing all your stories from Star Trek, from all the other things that you've worked on, and telling us also a little bit about your art career and your literary pursuits as well. And folks, do make sure you check out all those links that Duncan mentioned. We're going to have those below in the show notes, so you can make sure you click on over to those, check out his books, check out all of his work if you haven't before. It's some very fascinating stuff. I think you all enjoy it. Duncan, thank you so much again for your time. Really appreciate it. It's been wonderful.
Thank you too, Matthew. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
That was our chat with Duncan Regehr, an artist extraordinaire in every sense of the word. If you want to see some of Duncan's art or check out any of his books, there's going to be some links in the show notes, so do make sure you take a peek there if you're interested. The character of Shakaar had 3 appearances in Deep Space Nine, but the writers tried to have him show up a few more times, and there were some unused bits for some of the episodes he was in. In an earlier draft of Crossfire, a fireball would be hurtling down towards Shakaar and Kira, and Odo would have to choose who to save. Ultimately, he chose to protect Shakaar for the sake of duty, despite the fireball nearly killing Kira. Duncan was also planned to appear in the episode Body Parts, to have an intimate conversation with Kira about her having Keiko O'Brien's baby. And he was also part of an unused DS9 script called Patriots, where Jake Sisko discovers a political scandal involving Shakaar that would have shook the Bajoran government to its core. Now, while that episode didn't make it to air, it was in fact rewritten into the now famous In the Pale Moonlight episode. Now, as for the fate of Shakaar after Deep Space Nine, well, if you follow the books at all, and big spoiler alert here, Shakaar was in the DS9 relaunch novels and was, well, promptly assassinated during the ceremony for Bajor's entry into the Federation. But it was probably a good thing because, as it turns out, Shakaar was in fact under the control of some little parasites that you may remember from the TNG Season 1 finale, Conspiracy. Yeah, those little guys did come back, and we could do a whole show about them one day, but that's a whole other episode. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Trek Untold. If you aren't already, please make sure you're following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Trek Untold. And if you'd like to watch the video version of this podcast when available, make sure to check out youtube.com/nerdnews today. And don't forget you can also check out teespring.com/stores/Trek Untold. Check out all the Trek Untold merchandise we have, or consider supporting us on patreon.com/Trek Untold. Any contribution you can make helps keep this ship running at optimum power. But even just listening to the show and telling your friends about it does a pretty big thing for us too. So please leave a rating and review if you're listening to this in the audio form, or give the video on YouTube a thumbs up and sub to the channel. There's no wrong way to help Trek Untold out, so whether you're just dropping a review, giving us ratings, or if you're able to offer us any support monetarily, we thank you so much for doing that, and we also thank you for again choosing to listen to Trek Untold. Once again, thank you to our sponsor, Triple Fiction Productions. If you'd like to send us some feedback, suggest a guest, or ask to be booked as a guest on this show, or provide a sponsorship opportunity at Trek Untold, please email me at trekuntold@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on what you thought about this week's episode and our guest. I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, this has been Trek Untold, and until next time, fortune favors the bold.